The Edelman Trust Barometer 2021 has revealed widespread misinformation and mistrust in our leaders and societal institutions. Karina Carrera joins me in conversation for a little bit more on this. I'm Peter Ndoro, and this is For the Record. This Trust Barometer, what does it actually measure?
So our Trust Barometer is an annual survey, and it really looks at levels of trust across the four main institutions in society, that being business, government, NGOs and media. And it really looks at the levels of trust in those institutions and then some of the deeper issues that may be causing those levels to go up and down year on year.
And it's the trust that the public have in these four institutions. How do you measure it?
Well, we look at trust across four dimensions. It's really about ability. So is an institution able to just do its job properly? Integrity, is it honest? Dependability, does it keep its promises? Does it do what it says it's going to do, what it says it's going to do? And lastly, purpose. How much does it actually contribute to society? So those four dimensions together really amount to this idea of competence and ethics. Which is the sense of just your ability to do your job, but also are you considering the ethics that really play alongside that in terms of what the right thing to do is?
For some of those things, it sounds as if you talk to the public, and then others you actually talk to the institutions themselves.
Correct. So we work with institutions on how to build trust or rebuild trust in some situations. But it's also about really how they play that out in their own communications programs, how they manage their reputation against that. At Edelman, we believe that trust is the most important currency that an institution has with its stakeholder groups. And we know that it matters to the long-term sustainability of the institution.
So tell me a little bit about what the issues have been in terms of this trust report. What were the main drivers of the distrust, if there is?
So overall in South Africa, we saw trust levels increase marginally. We saw for the first time business overtake NGOs as being the most trusted institution, which is interesting. In the last 5 years, we've been studying that. Government still and media very much distrusted in the space, but still fairly small gains that I don't think we can ignore. So really looking at if we take the context of last year, and this research was conducted between October and November of last year in 2020, you can imagine the circumstances that we were all facing globally and closer to home in South Africa, and how that played into people's responses around how they were feeling at that point in time around trust.
Why don't people trust NGOs?
They do trust NGOs.
Okay.
I think year on year we've seen that flatline a little bit. I think if you consider the context of 2020 and the pandemic, NGOs were a little bit hamstrung. They weren't able to necessarily achieve what we needed to achieve on a large scale all on their own. So I think people still very much value the role of NGOs in society, but I think it was acknowledged that business potentially had to step up and really partner more effectively with those NGOs to deliver what people needed last year.
All right. If 100% is total trust, where are we hovering mostly in those four areas?
Well, as a country, we're hovering around, we're just outside of neutral. We're still lurking in the category of distrust. Unfortunately, we have gone up 4 points at a trust index, which is the average trust score across the four institutions. So I don't think we can discount those 4-point marginal gains that we made. But we would love to see South Africa getting into a more neutral category of really getting a sense that institutions are a little bit more trusted than they are.
Is government the one that struggles the most? One instinctively thinks so.
Unfortunately, they are. We've seen year on year they have suffered from the lowest levels of trust across the four institutions. That being said, this is the first year we saw a 7-point gain for government in levels of trust. Still very much distrusted, but certainly those gains that, again, I don't think we can ignore. We would love to see that trajectory and that trend continue in the coming years as we continue to measure trust. I'm
amazed that there's even any gains. I mean, you know, we switch on the television and there you have the Commission of Inquiry into State Capture, and it's across some of the biggest state-owned enterprises in the country. How do we reconcile that and some of the politicians that get arrested periodically with what looks like an improvement?
Well, I think a lot of those issues remain, and I think that's why we haven't seen an enormous increase in trust levels from government in the last year. That being said, in 2020, President Ramaphosa acted very swiftly in terms of the COVID response. We had one of the earliest lockdowns, and as much as it did deepen inequalities within the country, he felt it was necessary to do that. I think his response was well received, largely by the public. And I think that played into government's favour. I think the government had a real opportunity to put trust to the test last year and to really deliver results. And I think largely, based on the survey, that was acknowledged.
We live in a world, as Donald Trump likes to describe, as fake news. And I just wonder how much of that plays into people's trust levels, because conspiracy theories often sprout out of that kind of environment, and that affects how we perceive things around us. If it's QAnon in the States or wherever, here I'm finding, and it looks like campaigns where every Friday or every Saturday, Monday, you'll see a hashtag on social media berating the ANC, berating government. And I wonder if it isn't actually the machinations of some people. And that must play into the psyche of people in terms of trust.
Absolutely. And I think we've seen across all media sources last year, and if we think about media information sources, so not just media as a general organization, we've seen those levels of trust drop. I think it is important to also note that from a media perspective, largely a distrusted institution, which is unfortunate. What we saw last year was an important trend around what we call the infodemic, where there was a widespread acknowledgement that there seemed to be a lot of misinformation and disinformation that was really spread around the pandemic. And you can imagine, for the psyche of a society, when they're really suffering a severe crisis, particularly a health crisis, where often it's not understood by the average person, that one of the things you can do to put your mind at rest is to get information from the sources around you, and not to be able to rely on those sources to provide trustworthy, reliable, credible information is very, very worrying. And I think if that continues to perpetuate, that could be very, very destructive for a society.
Are people starting to sift through the information? I think, let's say, you switch on news on television. Do they say, I trust the BBC more than I trust another institution? Do I trust the SABC more than another institution? Or are we all painted with the same brush?
Unfortunately, we are all painted with the same brush. And we didn't test, to be fair, we didn't test specifically against particular news organizations.
Yeah.
I think our counterparts in the US, when we tested trust, you can imagine that it was a very distinctive bipartisan view around media and how that played out in the US. But I think closer to home, unfortunately, there's just this general perception that perhaps we don't know where to turn to, and we don't know really who to trust in this space.
What's the biggest problem, issue that we have in South Africa?
Well, what was highlighted in terms of the survey was this idea of education, healthcare, and poverty. Those were the main three increases that we saw in terms of how important people felt these are now to deal with as issues, fundamental issues and big issues to tackle. I think the healthcare makes sense given the context of what we had. I don't think we typically see healthcare at the top of the list. But education as well, if we consider the online learning environment and this idea of learners being left behind in that process potentially has put a huge strain on how we think about education going forward and how we rectify that. And poverty, we saw quite a lot of job losses last year. That's also playing into people's societal concerns. A lot of people reporting having seen retrenchments and redundancies in their spaces. So these are big issues to tackle, but important ones in terms of how we're seeing people's feelings right now.
When a business looks at this and they're busy trying to figure out this issue of trust, is it something that can be fixed?
It can be. I think it's steps and it's a process. It's not something that happens overnight. I think what we have seen with the gains that business has made in its levels of trust, and I think there was widespread acknowledgement of how well business responded in the pandemic in South Africa last year, and that's probably played into those higher trust scores for them. But I think really business has a mandate now to lead. And I think often where we see levels of trust drop in one institution, we see that played out in others. So where we see that government may lose points on trust, the society generally would turn to the other big institution of business to really try and step in and into that void and really step up and help with societal issues.
Is this something that, this barometer, is this something that maybe even government looks at, or they just get on with it regardless?
I would love to think that they look at the barometer.
Yeah.
I mean, we do have some public sector clients that we work with, and really, you know, the barometer is one test of trust, and it's an annual test, and it's an important global test, but it's really how trust plays out in reputation programs that I think institutions really see the benefit. If they are experiencing and working towards really putting efforts behind this idea of competence and ethics and showcasing that to their stakeholders, that's where we'll see institutions making the most gains.
We've talked a lot about different types of institutions. What about leaders individually? How are they faring in those different sectors?
Well, what we've seen is that trust seems to be becoming more local. And what that means is that where typically societies have reached out to broader societal leaders like government or business, they're just not feeling trust levels. I mean, over 70% really feeling like societal leaders are not trusted. And what that means then from a local perspective is that we're even seeing for the first time that my employer has really stood out as an important source of information and trust for employees, and those are people who specifically who were surveyed that are employees within an organization, and that fared much better than anyone else in terms of really seeing how does my employer actually play into my overall well-being. Are they safeguarding me? Are they giving me the information that I need? Are they preparing me for the skills for the future that I need? So this trust idea is moving much more local in a response to not perhaps receiving it from a broader basis.
Oh, is leadership then needing to think about changing in the way that they do things? I mean, you know, society changes over time. You talk about millennials and all these kinds of things. Do they want more transparency? Because I think when I was growing up, you just assumed that the guy in charge knows what he's doing.
Exactly.
But nowadays, they almost want proof.
They do want proof, and we've seen year on year actually, probably the last 5 years or so, we've seen this trend towards that, where consumers and employees really want a seat at the table. Consumers and customers really saying they will punish brands and organizations that don't respond in the right way to issues, and that means, you know, hitting them where it hurts, you know, really not buying their products or buying their services, and that's a concern. And I guess at a public sector that's easier, a public sector perspective that's easier to manage. But certainly for other institutions, it's worrying because it does put pressure on trust overall.
And I guess if you don't have a great trust score, that can put pressure on the bottom line if you're a business, votes if you're a government, and donations if you're an NGO.
Absolutely. We know that trust matters because we've been measuring it for so long, and we've seen how it works in reputation programs. As you say, I mean, we really see companies have more institutional investment. We see customers being more loyal. We see employees becoming more engaged. And what also happens is that organizations actually become more resilient to crises. So when you think about the COVID pandemic as a major crisis of last year, those organizations who have perhaps fared better have already made sure that they have those fundamental trust pillars in place to deal with that.
All right, and perhaps finally, how's South Africa doing compared to the rest of the world?
South Africa is not far off the scores in comparison to the rest of the world. We've seen on certain issues very much like for like. I think there are some issues that you can generally see a trend in terms of more emerging market trends versus more of the developed markets. I think at a government trust level, unfortunately, we're still on the lower end of the spectrum. We'd love to see gains in that regard. But really in terms of levels of trust, and particularly what we saw last year around this idea of the infodemic, I think we're all suffering from the same uncertainty in that space.
Karina Carrera, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much indeed.
Thank you, Peter.